This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 524 of the Late Round Podcast, so the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. A handful of years ago, I did a couple of studies on finding breakout running backs and wide receivers in fantasy football. I then rehashed those last year, bringing forth some new data and some new ideas. And I ended up doing a tight end study as well. People really liked them. The article series actually won a Fantasy Sports Writers Association award for Best Football Ongoing Series last year. So over the next 3 weeks, I'm going to do episodes on those studies for each position. I'll look back at what the studies told us, whether there's new information that we should be considering, and then I'll give some breakout picks for the 2021 season. Now, before getting into the study, the 2021 NBA Finals are finally upon us, and FanDuel and Taco Bell are teaming up to add an extra layer of excitement to the action. Introducing the FanDuel Sportsbook Taco Bell NBA Finals Comeback Bonus. The terms are simple. All you have to do is head to FanDuel Sportsbook before tip-off and place a $25 or more pre-live moneyline bet on either team to win. If the team you bet on overcomes a halftime deficit to win, you'll be eligible to receive a $10 bonus in FanDuel site credit. You'll win your bet and you'll earn a bonus. Now that's more ways to win thanks to our friends at Taco Bell. Users must opt into the promo in order to be eligible for the bonus payout. Eligible every NBA Finals game until the bonus hits, must be 21 years or older, and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max bonus $10. Restrictions apply. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Virginia, Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789, or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. Last year's study on spotting breakout running backs went a little bit like this. I went back and looked at all running backs drafted since 2011, so this doesn't include players who went undrafted in deeper leagues. And I plotted overall average draft position on the x-axis versus points scored on the y-axis. I then made a trend line that helped us show expectation. That trend line is the number of points we'd expect a running back to score at a particular average draft position. From there, I wanted to see which running backs exceeded expectation most. But since we're talking about breakout running backs, I'm not as interested in early round running backs. I want a list of running backs who were drafted in the middle and the late rounds who exceeded expectation by a whole lot of fantasy points. So I looked at all running backs who were drafted after round 5 where opportunity cost tends to become less significant. And I looked at running backs who outperformed their ADP expectation by 100 or more fantasy points across the season. That gave me 39 breakout running backs when I did this study last year. But we had 5 more in 2020. So we're now technically working with 44 running backs. I then looked at the 39 running backs from last year's study to find trends in the data. What type of qualities did these running backs share? What are the things that we should look for when trying to pinpoint middle and late round running back selections? What I found were 4 common trends. The first was that the breakout running backs, they're rarely handcuffs. Only 6 of the 39 running backs had a running back teammate with an average draft position in the top 24. And that represents the first 2 rounds of a 12-team league. I'll get to more on this in a second. The second trend, which plays into the first, was that these running backs came from what I call ambiguous backfields. This makes sense intuitively. Since the majority of them aren't handcuffs, that means a lot of them are coming from backfields with non-elite running backs. What's interesting, though, is where their teammates are typically getting drafted. So again, we have 39 running backs in our sample. It's 44 now, but I'm just going off of what the study said last year. In our sample, 30 of these running backs had a teammate drafted ahead of them. That's not surprising since they're middle to late round picks. The average top running back in these breakout running back backfields, he was selected at pick 59. So think about what that means. You've got these breakout running backs and they're coming from teams where the top running back is basically a 5th to 6th round pick in a 12-team league. Hence the ambiguous backfield thing. I'm going to dive deep into the ambiguous backfield stuff on today's show. So bear with me. The next trend was that breakout running backs, they're usually pass catchers. They had a larger proportion of their touches come via the air than on the ground. And then the final point was that age didn't seem to be a big factor. We had plenty of breakout running backs who were older in age. So I wouldn't let that specifically deter you from picking a running back. In a tiebreaker, I'd go with the younger player, but older running backs can exceed ADP expectation as well. Now, like I said, we had 5 more running backs join this sample in 2020. Those players were James Robinson, David Montgomery, Mike Davis, J.D. McKissick, and Nyheim Hines. For the record, the ADP data that I'm using is from myfantasyleague.com. Generally speaking, these players followed the trends. You've got running backs of all ages there, and 4 of the 5 were part of fairly ambiguous backfields. And each player was involved heavily as receivers, with 2 of them being strictly pass-catching backs. But there was a handcuff. I know you guys are all screaming listening to this saying, but JJ, Mike Davis was a handcuff. He worked out. But just because the trend says that doesn't happen all that often, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Of course it can happen. And that's the first thing I want to get to. I think the ambiguous backfield portion of this study is the most important to grasp. It's also something I feel like people have taken away most from that study. I get questions about it all the time. So let me dig into the concept a little bit further. We've now seen 7 breakout running backs come from teams with a running back who was drafted in the top 24, or the first 2 rounds of 12-team leagues. 4 of them came from round 1. So it's not that handcuffs can't happen. It's just that number 1, it doesn't happen at as high of a rate as a more ambiguous backfield. And number 2, the handcuffs who do pan out aren't the ones you think they are. The 4 true running back handcuffs that have panned out have been James Conner, D'Angelo Williams, Fred Jackson, and Mike Davis. None of those players had very high ADPs the year that they broke out. Fred Jackson had the highest, and he was being selected at pick 132. So we're talking not even the early double-digit rounds for these guys. There was a study done recently by my good friend Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis. I'm going to reference this study on the show a lot today, because it really gives a different perspective on all this breakout running back talk. The study came at running back value from a different perspective. Instead of looking at running backs who far exceeded ADP, Rich analyzed top 24 seasons and top 12 seasons at the position, so RB1 and RB2 seasons. His research found similar results about running back handcuffs, that they don't hit very often. He looked back to 2010, and since 2010, he noted that 71 running backs had an ADP in the first round of fantasy drafts. And of those 71, 8 had RB2s on their teams by ADP that gave us a top 24 season. And just 3 of them had top 12 seasons: D'Angelo Williams, James Conner, and Fred Jackson, the 3 I just talked about. Essentially, you're not getting a high-end season from one of these traditional handcuffs very often. But not only that, the typical high-end handcuffs that the fantasy community seems to covet every year, they don't tend to pan out at any better of a rate than some random ones later in the draft. As Rich put it, having a running back picked in the top 100 that also isn't the first running back selected on their team and asking them to hit, that's rare. He's got data in this study that backs that up as well. Of the 52 running backs who were their team's RB2s since 2010 who were also drafted in the top 100, only 31% finished the season higher than their positional ADP. It doesn't mean that Alexander Madison or Tony Pollard can't work out. It's just that historically, those types of players haven't, especially compared to other random handcuffs that you can get later. Now comes a really interesting part. I've been talking about ambiguous backfields for some time, but we may be able to dive a little bit deeper into that concept and be more accurate. Rich found that the hit rate of team RB1s who were being selected outside the top 24 at their position, that they were also better than the typical team RB2s drafted outside the top 24 at their position when focusing on top 100 picks. To put this another way, let's say you've got a pick in the middle rounds, in that round 7 or 6 to 10 range. That's generally when the top 24 running backs are gone. If you go after a team's RB1 instead of a team's RB2, you're increasing your odds that that player is going to pan out. And that aligns with my data as well. With my data, since 2011, I have 81 running backs who were drafted between picks 61 and 108, so rounds 6 through 9, who were their team's RB1. Of those 81, 8 finish as a breakout running back, or a running back who exceeded ADP expectation by 100 or more points. That's a hit rate close to 10%. If you look at team RB2s or worse who were drafted in that same range, we've got a hit rate of 3 out of 62. That's less than 5%. So you're twice as likely to find a breakout running back in the middle rounds if that breakout running back is the RB1 on his own team. Now we can then break this RB1 thing out by RB1s who have teammates that are drafted later and RB1s who don't have teammates drafted later. And what I mean by that is, what happens if the backfield is truly ambiguous? As in, what if you had a running back drafted in round 6 through 9 who also had a teammate, an RB2 teammate, drafted in round 6 through 9? But then what if you had an RB1 drafted in round 6 through 9 without a teammate drafted around there? Now, I'm interested in this because these types of backfields, while they're both ambiguous, they're pretty different. One of these backfields says, we don't seem entirely sure who the RB1 on this team is. The other one is saying, oh, we know who the RB1 is. We just don't think the situation is very good. Let's start with more of the standalone RB1s. The guys who are being drafted in those middle rounds but don't have a teammate getting selected in the middle rounds with them. This has happened 64 times since 2011. So 64 running backs since 2011 have been drafted from picks 61 through 108, and they don't have a teammate drafted in that range with them. Of those 64 instances, we've had 4 breakouts. We've had 4 players who exceeded expectation by 100 or more points. That's a 6.3% hit rate. On average, RB1s who fit this criteria have exceeded expectation by less than 1 fantasy point. So it looks like there's not a whole lot going on there. That 6.3% hit rate is still better than the hit rate from team RB2s being drafted in that range, but it's still not that great. The thing is, we know that team RB1s have a breakout running back hit rate close to 10%. So that means the truly ambiguous backfields like San Francisco this year, those backfields must be bringing the gold. And they are. Since 2011, we've had 17 instances where a running back was drafted as the RB1 on his team in rounds 6 through 9, but he also had a teammate drafted in rounds 6 through 9. In one case, which was Miles Sanders in 2019, he had 2 teammates drafted between picks 61 and 108. Again, rounds 6 through 9. So of those 17 instances where you get these teammates that are close together in ADP, the RB1 exceeded expectation 11 times. That's a 65% hit rate, just in terms of exceeding expectation. But get this, on top of that, the average difference between expectation and result was plus 36 fantasy points. Meaning these RB1s on average exceeded expectation by a fairly significant amount. We have 4 breakout running backs from this 17-player sample. That's a hit rate of 24%. Now on the flip side, the RB2s on those teams didn't fare very well. The average expectation difference is a decrease of 14 points, which makes sense because if the RB1s are panning out at a high rate, the RB2s probably aren't. Guys, I can't even explain how excited I was when I saw this data, when I realized all of this. Here's what we know about ambiguous backfields now. Breakout running backs tend to come from them. We want running backs in the middle and late rounds from ambiguous backfields more than running backs who are handcuffs. From there, we want running backs in the middle and late rounds who are the RB1s on their own team. And then from there, we want running backs who are the RB1 on their own teams who also have teammates who are being drafted in the middle rounds with them. Some may be wondering why the data is screaming this at us. Why is the data saying this? Why do these really ambiguous backfields seem to produce breakout running backs more than the backfields that have more separation between RB1 and RB2? And I think the answer to that is because if a running back is being drafted in the middle rounds, and if he's clearly the RB1 on his own team, then there's likely something going on with that team situation itself that's turning people off. Like Michael Carter this year. I don't mind Michael Carter because we do know that if you're looking for a breakout running back, RB1s are better than RB2s. But the hit rate of these clear-cut RB1s in the middle rounds is not great. So he's a better option than RB2s in his range, but it doesn't make him an ideal option, despite the fact that he's got the pass-catching angle on his side. An example of a true ideal option given this data is someone like Chase Edmonds. He's being drafted in that pick 61 to 108 range. He's got the pass catching side down, and James Conner is often drafted before round 10 hits. Javonte Williams is trending away from being part of this group, but he sort of fits this as well, with Melvin Gordon being the RB2 that you'd want to avoid. Travis Etienne is another player who's sort of on the fringe here, but he definitely fits most of the criteria, and he has James Robinson still as a top 100 pick in his backfield. Robinson then is someone that you probably want to avoid. And Trey Sermon's another one that you could be targeting. He's the most obvious one given all of this data, I think. We typically just don't see the RB2s from those types of teams hit at nearly as high of a rate as the RB1s. And I think this really gives us a good glimpse to the fact that while ADP is not everything, the fantasy community does do a pretty decent job at sifting through these ambiguous backfields. We should give ourselves a little bit more credit. We spot the RB1s far more often than not. This is one of those studies where I sat down and I really spent a lot of time sifting through the data to try to come forward with a cohesive way to present this data. And it's one of those studies that's truly changing the way that I view some players this year. A month ago, I wasn't all that into Chase Edmonds. I thought he was just fine. But I think this data is really telling us that Chase Edmonds is a good pick right now. There shouldn't be anything wrong with that. We should change our opinions with new and better information. And hopefully that'll happen with some of you after listening to today's show. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.